Well, afternoon, friends. Um, for those who are in the Eastern time zone, like myself, it's lunchtime. For others who are on the West Coast, you may just be having your morning coffee. And we welcome you to Church Innovations webinar on adaptive change. Let me first introduce our panelists. Pat Keifert is the founder of Church Innovations. Mark Love is program director for the master's program in missional leadership at Rochester University and is a consultant for Church Innovations. Cheryl Russell is the preaching minister at New Heritage Fellowship Faith Community in Texas. And my name is Nathan Pickard, and I serve the Newmarket Church of Christ and am a practitioner with Church Innovations. We're going to ask that you insert comments, questions, discussion into the chat room, and we will engage you in the conversation throughout the next hour. I want to set the stage for Mark to give an introduction to adaptive change and why we're talking about it. There's three areas of the church's life that I keep hearing people talk about. And I've kind of described these three areas as bums in the seats, financials, and evangelism. And years ago, these were three areas of the church's life that we struggled with in the faith community I serve. And we threw everything we knew at these three areas, but with dwindling results. And the answers we once used to solve dwindling numerical growth no longer were adequate. The answers we once used to stop the bleeding of dwindling monetary donations were no longer sufficient. And the answers we once used for questions around evangelism, they no longer were relevant. And we found ourselves in an adaptive change moment. And our hunch is the pandemic even further into an adaptive change moment. So Mark, I hope I've set the stage for you. Let me turn it over to you to give us a proper introduction. And why are we talking about adaptive change at this time?
Well, I don't know, Nathan, that mine's any more proper than the one you just gave, because yours put hands and feet on it. But I've been saying now for years, when I'm with church leaders and they nod knowingly, I'll tell them, you're doing everything you know to do better than you've ever done it before, but with diminishing impact. And they'll nod, yeah. This, I think, is evidence that we're in a moment that calls for adaptive change or adaptive work. So let me do a little definitional work as we begin. We're borrowing the phrase adaptive change from Heifetz and Linsky in their book, Leadership on the Line. And they distinguish there between technical and adaptive change. A technical change is one that is diagnosable and the outcomes are therefore predictable. We already possess the expertise to figure out what's going on and therefore what might fix it. But in an adaptive situation, adaptive change is called for when the problem is chronic, when you've thrown several things at it, yet with no satisfying outcomes, which may indicate that you don't know yet what the actual problem is. And because you can't diagnose a situation, it also means you can't reasonably predict outcomes, which means you'll have to adapt. You will have to experiment and likely fail and learn to ask then good questions of your failures. Not, did this work? Why or why not? But what did we learn? What surprised us? What might God be calling us to do or to be? And because you don't have, in the midst of adaptive change, the expertise to diagnose and fix what ails you, you will need new partners. You'll need outsiders who might have new ways of seeing things and who might be potential partners with you in the mission of God. The word missional represents an adaptive challenge. You can't get to missional through technical changes. In fact, it might make it worse. It might make it, it might mean you have to travel farther to get to the goal of missional. You won't get it by fixing your worship, which is a technical change, or doing more outreach. Missional requires more than doing new things, though it certainly will require that, but it requires that we become something different. No longer vendors of religious goods or services, but outposts for the kingdom of God. Missional work is adaptive work, spiritual work, and not simply program work. All right, give me a second here while I share my screen. I want to go back at this point to things that we learned from Keifert and Lenski. And they, in their book, Leadership Online, talk about the dangers of leading in the midst of adaptive work. So they will say, in mobilizing adaptive work, you have to engage people in adjusting their unrealistic expectations, rather than try to satisfy them as if the situation were amenable primarily to technical remedy. You have to counteract their exaggerated dependency and promote their resourcefulness. This takes an extraordinary level of presence, time, and artful communication, but it may also take more time and trust that you have. So not great news along the lines of adaptive work. You're having to adjust expectations. You're having to counteract their dependency upon you and promote their resourcefulness. And this takes time and patience, and not just a little bit of art. So Keifert and Lenski go on to say that generally people do not authorize people to make them face what they do not want to face. Thus, leadership requires disturbing people, but at a rate they can absorb. And if you're like me, you kind of react to that word disturbing. But disturbing is different than harder words like deconstructing or destroying people. But it does require that you disturb them at a rate that they can absorb. And there's the art of adaptive change, right? Calling people into new experiences that disrupts what they've known all along, but at a rate that they can absorb. Finally, I want to quote Keifert and Linsky. They say our habits, values, and attitudes come from somewhere, and to abandon them means to be disloyal to their origin. And I know that you know that pressure of calling people to let go of things to which they're highly committed, because it feels like them to be treason, against the people and ways of doing things that have come before. So here's the deal. You can't get adaptive change apart from anxiety and conflict. And our instincts related to anxiety and conflict are twofold. First, we do everything we can to make the conflict go away instead of seeing it as energy for change. Second, we respond to anxiety in our systems with greater measures of control instead of greater measures of trust. We try to get our arms around everything.
Mark, could you say those last two sentences again? They're so important.
Yeah. So first, we do everything we can to make the conflict go away instead of seeing it as energy for change. Conflict can be destructive, but it also can be the leverage we need for things to change. Second, we respond to anxiety in our systems with greater measures of control instead of greater measures of trust. We think if we can get our arms around it and make people do what we want them to do, that the problem will get better. But usually that kind of amplifies the anxiety within the system. It diminishes trust, which is your most important asset as a leader. So we need to instead respond to the extent that we can with greater measures of trust. And trust is a spiritual capacity. And all of this means that spiritual life of the leader is essential for leading adaptively, paying attention to our God-centered identity, maintaining that through spiritual practices and modeling those for others in our congregation is absolutely essential for taking up adaptive work. But so is creating environments that have to be maintained that allow members to engage this work without falling apart. And this is what Keifert and Linsky call holding spaces. And in Partnership for Missional Church, which is something we do with congregations at Church Innovations, we work on both of these things very intensely so that we can be partners with congregations in the work of doing adaptive, in taking up adaptive work. So we seek to help congregations in both these ways by encouraging leaders to attend to their spiritual lives and by helping congregations create holding spaces in which they can take up difficult adaptive work without falling apart. So that's kind of the definitional bit related to what we're discussing today. A little bit abstract maybe, and we're flying at 20,000 feet still. But don't fear, we have effective practitioners who have stories of working in the midst of adaptive change. I think particularly in the midst of the pandemic, we didn't know how to respond to all of that. And so we're immediately thrown into an adaptive moment. So I'm going to turn things over now to Cheryl Russell and let her talk about her experience of adaptive change with her congregation.
Thank you, Mark, and it's good to be here. Thanks for inviting me to participate in this panel. Mark, there was a question for you that popped up in the chat. I don't know if you want to answer that now or come back to it later. Okay, later. So I'm the pastor at New Heritage Fellowship Church, and it's a small church on the north side of Dallas. And this is my 3rd year. And so I had 1 year and then COVID hit like 14 months after I started. So I was very fortunate that in my 1st year, the focus that I had and that our leadership really wanted me to lean into was relationship building in the church. And so that 1st year, I got to spend a lot of time getting to know our members and form relationships over coffee or drinks, dinner, meals, and activities, getting to know what people at the church valued and looking for usable future in the past and the history of New Heritage. And improving communication was a big thing that they wanted me to work on. And of course, along with that, establishing trust. And I was very happy that that was where they wanted me to spend the majority of my time in year 1, as I said, because COVID hit 14 months after that. And we moved fully on to Zoom as a church. We did everything on Zoom for over a year. I think that those relationships allowed us to make that transition and stay a healthy church community. We ended up having a lot of fun. And of course, I attribute a lot of that ability to make that transition to our church's level of creativity and flexibility. Also, I'm fortunate that New Heritage already had a very well-nurtured discernment climate. And so that obviously helped a great deal. And so over that year, we spent a lot of time having fun together over Zoom as much as we could. We had a Zoom bingo, Zoom Christmas pageants, we had talent shows. On Pentecost Sunday, we had a combined worship service with another church in Nashville all over Zoom. And that was a lot of fun. We really stayed in touch with each other a lot more, I think, over Zoom and got to see each other's, living environments and where one another lives. And we had a lot of guest speakers. So we had a lot of fun over that time. Let's see, some other things that I thought about are one of the things that we wondered in switching to all Zoom format is, are we going to be able to maintain our level of intimacy over whoever knows how long? And so that was one of those adaptive questions that we were not sure about. And what ended up happening was that we did increase our intimacy over that time over Zoom. Somehow, I'm gonna guess it was the Spirit, we were able to have even greater intimacy than we had before. And a lot of our folks ended up really appreciating getting to see one another's faces and not just the backs of people's heads in church pews. We also did some great studies in Acts and Exodus and Nehemiah, which had tremendous parallels for what we were experiencing with COVID, talking about displacement and rebuilding and bridging the space that was between us physically. And the conversations we had while we were in Acts were really significant. I think that really changed our view of what church could be. And a lot of us, including myself, had a lot of doubts about whether or not church was possible over the computer, or if that even was church. And we came to see things very differently. In fact, now we have a Zoom service for most of our gatherings. And so on Sunday morning, we have a Zoom component and our in-person component. So our Zoomers and our roomers are together in one space. And it's also highly participatory. We've been doing dwelling in the Word for all 3 of these years, which has been also a tremendous help in this last 2 unprecedented years of COVID. But that has been a really fun experiment, bringing those two platforms together. Yeah, I think that's a good introduction and some of our experience dealing. I'd say the first 3 years of my ministry have been totally loaded with adaptive change. And then, of course, being the first female minister that has been a part of this church. So I kind of already started with that adaptive change in front of me, but that's, yeah.
Cheryl, I know that one of the early challenges you had was related to dwelling in the Word as a congregation, and then your notions of a shared pulpit. You're not doing all the preaching, but it's shared throughout the congregation. It seems to me that those kinds of shifts take extraordinary trust. And you were at the very beginning of your ministry. So talk about maybe a little, and let me say too, that I think these shifts early also prepared you for the shifts that you made during COVID. Does that prompt anything more for you to say? Because how you lead through the change, and you were in immediately.
Right. Well, I was fortunate that the New Heritage was already doing a shared pulpit before I got there. And so that was already in place. And so there was already a great deal of trust there. And of course, that has helped us, I think, to move it even further to inviting other people into that space from all over. During COVID, we took advantage of being able to have speakers from all over the world. And so I think that there was trust there. And what happened with COVID was we got to share that trust with even more people. And then dwelling in the Word, that was something that I did get to introduce. And it has been, I think, a great blessing and that people really enjoy, and was helpful during the time we were in COVID, because we could break off into breakout rooms, into groups of 2 or 3, and reinforce whatever dwelling passage we were in, which we tried to make connect with our experience during COVID. And so that was helpful. And again, in introducing that relationship was important. We didn't just say, we're going to do this, but it was a process of, yeast spreading into the dough and inviting people over to have a meal and to practice it first. And thankfully, again, the church was very amenable to trying something different. And so now we're 3 years in.
Mark, you're on mute. Were you pointing at me?
Yeah, trying to get you going, Nathan.
Well, so I serve a very established faith community, almost 60 years of life in this neighborhood. So the story I want to tell isn't about COVID per se. It's about those times where we were trying to meet our neighbors. And we threw everything to meet our neighbors. We did mailing, knocked on doors, put up a new church sign. Nothing worked. And then one day I had a really unfortunate event take place. I was sitting in my office for the afternoon. It was getting around dinner. And so I was going to go home and have dinner with my wife. And I left the office. I jumped in my standard Chevy S10 pickup truck. And I realized that I forgot a book that I wanted to read in the evening sitting on my desk. So I went back into my office and I picked up the book off my desk. And I looked out my office window and I saw my truck had slipped out of gear and was rolling down the hill, and it rolled through the fence of the condominium directly east of the church property. It came back through the fence and it disappeared in a drainage ditch that was about 20 feet deep, 30 feet wide, and about 60 feet long at the front of our church. It just disappeared inside this ditch. And so you can imagine some of the words and the thoughts that came out of my mouth at the time. And I called my wife and I said, I'm going to be a little late for dinner. She wasn't happy. But that's when we met our neighbors. That experience introduced us to our neighbors. So for the next several weeks, as I would walk to the office now, because I was without a truck while it was getting repaired, the neighbors would hang out the condominium windows and they would yell at me. I hope when you get your truck back, preacher, that you'll put a parking brake on, or, where's your truck today? And then they would start laughing, right? But that's how we met our neighbors. And one day I realized that I'm the only person in this church who can name people who live in this neighborhood. And so we went over to the condominium and we asked our neighbors to join us on a Sunday night to tell us about the neighborhood. Tell us who lives in this neighborhood and tell us what goes on in this neighborhood. And out of that experience, we met some of our neighbors, and then through that conversation, we started a community garden. And that community garden has been a catalyst for us to continually meet our neighbors to this day.
I like two things about, well, I love the story. It's so Nathan and Katie, but I like two elements there, Nathan. First of all, in your strategic plan for getting to know the neighborhood, there was not written anywhere in that, run my pickup through the neighbor's fence, right? So it came completely by surprise, right? And through something that you would have never intentionally done. Number two, I like the fact that you use that occasion to reverse kind of the movement of host and guest. Now, instead of you being the host, inviting other people to be your guests, now the people in the neighborhood are hosting the telling of stories about the neighborhood. So again, if we're in technical mode, we tend to think that we have all the expertise we need. But when something surprises us and causes the neighbors to mock us as we walk to our office every morning, now there's a possibility for outsiders to be the ones who teach us something about our life. So I think it's a great example of adaptive work. And I think the move that you made to be hosted is great adaptive leadership. What are you hearing, Pat, as you hear Cheryl and Nathan tell stories? You're muted. There we go.
I think you can hear me now, yeah? So I'm just thrilled. There's so many rich things here, but I want to emphasize a couple. I want to underline what you just said, Mark. For years, it has become clear to me that congregations that learn how to be hosted rather than host initially in their congregation, but you put your finger on it, it's a back and forth dynamic of hosting and welcoming, because Nathan also talked about that experience of unintentional vulnerability. Now, you have to understand, when those sorts of things happen, and they always will in congregational life, it's what we do with that vulnerability. You understand? Because I have known congregations to become highly defensive and have to step back into the fortress mentality, or worse, this is the common move, to imagining that hospitality is an analogy to inviting someone to the intimate space of dinner at your house. And I guarantee you, if that had been the first move for Newmarket Church, it would have been a dead end, right? It's a very different posture to be vulnerable, to be, the butt of the community's jokes. And what was curious to me in this story, and I'm not saying I've only heard it once, so it's almost becoming iconic in my imagination, is this capacity for just one person, Nathan, to begin to create that bicultural bridge between the community, the many publics that every congregation has, and to do that adaptive change. Now, this is the second point I want to talk about, and Cheryl did a nice job of illustrating this. Mike Moyna, who is kind of, if you will, the chief theologian for the Fresh Expressions movement in the Church of England, talks about, in I think it's his most recent book, a very practical issue about this experimenting to create these bicultural bridges for our congregation. And that is, when you do your experimenting, you need to moderate your risks. This is something both Linsky and Keifert also note. Our tendency, and this is a problem in the church in general, is we tend to go for the big, hairy, audacious goal, the BHAG, the dramatic, preachable change, so that we go from being, for example, the church of which I'm happily and blessed to be a member of, the most homogeneous white church in North America. And then we start, since 1988, when we went into business, announcing how we'd have these goals of 10% persons of color, persons whose language was other than English, etc. And of course, I stood there with the leadership in the multicultural community leadership, knowing that one, it would fail, number two, they'd get blamed. And sure enough, these sorts of big, hairy, audacious goals, whether it's at a huge church level or the local congregation, don't get adaptive change. And we got to stop, I don't know what it is, a virtue, seeking to be virtuous, instead to really recognize our own vulnerability and dependence upon the other. The way Nathan's story illustrates that, and Cheryl's does, that we're taking a risk here. We're trying to build trust, and we're not in control, but we're moderating the risk. And this is my main point. Learning to take moderate risks. So one of the things Mike Moyna points out is that almost all successful big-time entrepreneurs, part of their genius is, yes, they think outside of the box. They imagine, they become dependent upon someone else and vulnerable, but they moderate their risks. So I want to, those are the two things I want to, learning how to become vulnerable, depend upon the hospitality other. For us as Christians, we believe that other is finally God, right? Well worthy of our trust. And two, that we need to moderate our risks.
I want to get to some of the comments in the chat, Pat. I want to start with Noel's question about how can you kind of receive the blessing from the congregation to lead adaptively. How does that take place? How can you generate that trust? And I want to say two things about that in a minute. But then Ben, Pat asks, in what ways has added attention to issues of systemic racism, patriarchy, LGBTQ plus justice, and issues like this, how has that contributed to our adaptive moment? And are there any kind of insights we have about that? I'm going to let you take that one after I address Noel. So I would say two things, Noel. I know the one way not to engender the kind of trust you're seeking for the congregation to authorize this work is that they feel like the fix is in. That you've already decided, you or a group of leaders have already decided what changes you want to see take place, and you're simply tricking them, into going along with what you want to do. So Pat talked about the vulnerability in Nathan's story and how powerful that then became, how genuine then the listening became on the other side of that. And I think this is a problem for both leaders and congregants, that we think leadership should never be vulnerable. It should always be decisive. We should always be pointing the direction to go boldly and firmly. And adaptive says, wait a minute, we don't know. And so we're going to have to be vulnerable to the moment and listen. The key, I think, there, what I think Cheryl does a great job of, and what I would recommend from Heifetz and Linsky is, again, creating a holding space. And what is the holding space? It's a set of kind of community-wide agreements that we have that allow us to take up difficult work without being overwhelmed by the conflict that comes with it. So what are the kinds of things that go into that? Well, identifying shared values and assumptions is a big one. What could we run up the flagpole that everyone would salute? What are the shared values and assumptions that we have as a congregation? How can we name those and carry those into our discussions, into our future? Identifying key peoples and networks and strengthening lateral bonds of affection is what Heifetz and Linsky call it. But strengthening relationships, knowing particularly where people on different sides of issues that you anticipate have strong relationships, and make sure that those bonds and ties are emphasized. Telling stories of times when the congregation took risks that ended up resulting in new life. We could go on with these kinds of things, coming up with agreements about how it is we should talk to each other as a congregation, that we won't assign motives, that we'll attempt to understand before we critique or disagree. These kinds of things, and create an environment that has to be tended to by leadership for productive conversation around adaptive work to take place. So Pat, what about Ben's question?
Already going back into the 1980s, CI was doing research on congregations trying to do moral discernment as a community. And we started with 10 Evangelical Lutheran Church in America congregations in Southwest Minnesota. And back then there was yet one more example of the farm crisis. So we had a chance to watch congregations go through a crisis of their local community, losing lots of farmers because their land became too valuable and they couldn't produce enough income every year to pay off the debt they had on the land. But right at the same time, the first blow up on LGBTQ plus hit with the leaking of the human sexuality document. And so we had a chance to watch how can congregations respond on these issues, which are very deeply felt. And believe me, in rural community, rural economy, and the family farm go deeper than sex. And the need for secrecy because your own value of your land was dependent upon it was great to compare and contrast. And we've followed up on those studies and shown certain patterns that respond to Ben's question. And what they are is the stuff you've already said, Mark, but let me fill it in a bit. Number one, those congregations who were able to take on the questions around same-sex attraction, the diversity of gender and identity issues within a holding environment where there was sufficient trust. And I love the way you pointed out Heifetz and Linsky's language of lateral bonds of affection and strengthening those bonds of affection. We literally have story after story in these communities where someone knew a school teacher or a member of the church choir that were in a lifelong same-sex relationship, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All these stories got told to one another within the context of these relationships. Those congregations were able to deal with the conflictual issues far better. I'm not saying it was easy. I'm not saying people weren't angry. Oh my goodness, right? But they were able to come out stronger at the end and be a part of their community's answer to those challenges rather than a problem. That capacity, and of course, you had leadership who knew how to create that moderating environment. That doesn't mean advocacy has no place, but those, and here's a really blunt lesson, and we've seen it repeated over and over again for 40 years now. If you wish to lead and be a spiritual leader in that community that's going through that kind of adaptive challenge, one, you have to decide right up front, do I want to give my primary capacity and spend the trust I have being a faithful leader of discernment and giving up the desire to control outcome? Or do I want to be an advocate for a certain outcome? You cannot do both. And they're both very valuable acts, but they're two very different ways of participating. If you give yourself over, if you empty yourself of having it turn out the way you want it, you're going to have way more capacity to create that matrix, that holding environment for which that kind of change can take place. You have to, of course, ask yourself in terms of conscience, and I think it's wise to announce to the congregation, here's some outcomes that my conscience will not allow. And you have to state your conscience. I could go on in this, but we've got lots of data on the ways in which you can capture this conflict over really important questions in life and help it focus upon mission.
Kent and others have noted what they've done in terms of involving people in worship, either through streaming or Zoom. And it's good to see those comments. I was intrigued, though, by Kent's comment that they have online greeters welcoming and engaging people online, which seems to me to be a really important thing. And I think the moment right now calls for us to kind of collect stories, because I think there's a real difference between streaming and Zooming. They do different things. They produce different kinds of results. And it might be interesting now for us to, in this adaptive moment, to say, if you chose streaming, what are the outcomes that you've experienced? If you chose Zooming, what are the outcomes that you've experienced? I don't know how to do that, but I would love to see from Kent more description about what you did and how you did that, and maybe an email to Pat at Church Innovations, or just this is for all of you. Send emails to the Church Innovations email address that I'm sure you can find on the website. I'm sure of it. I know I'm sure of it. So, but I think that would be important stuff to take pay attention to right now. I'm wondering, Cheryl, Nathan, have things occurred to you to add as you've been listening?
Regarding Ben's question, I do feel like those things that Ben listed have added pressure in terms of adaptive challenges for churches. And I think why is because it seems like there's a lot of suspicion wrapped up in whatever, side you take on things. And people seem really defensive. And so I think that adds a lot of challenge to transformation and to our the width of our welcome. And for us, I think dwelling in the word has been key to have how we interact with those issues as they're brought forward, how we talk about them, is because we've focused really hard on listening. And so I think that dwelling in the word has helped us navigate some of those difficult topics that are really important for the church, I think, to engage going forward. But listening has been key.
I think for myself, hearing you and Pat talk about the vulnerability of leaders has been really good for me to hear, and not allowing the fixes in, right? That in the adaptive change, we don't quite know what's about to happen. And we can't control what's about to happen. And we can't control what's about to emerge. And that has been a really helpful piece to this conversation for me in my context and what we're facing, right, as a church. Yeah.
You're muted, Pat. Still.
Is it off now?
You're good now.
Great. These last couple of minutes, I want to underline a couple of dynamics we've learned, but also to offer a free resource that's a proven way of helping congregations thrive in the midst of even very, very, very high levels of conflict around adaptive change. And it's through our website. It's called Thriving in Change. And there's all sorts of resources, even down to ways to planning a church council meeting, et cetera, ways of helping you create that matrix, that holding environment, so that people can talk about really tough questions in their local church and do that sort of painful discernment that Acts describes, and work towards that really spirit-blessed moment if it seems good to us and the Holy Spirit. Messy as that might be, and believe me, it's messy. Thriving in Change, lots of stuff there. I want to add one little thing, and that is we have found that an extraordinary number of people experience advocacy on the part of their local spiritual leader as shaming. And I don't want to use shaming as an excuse for the spiritual leader not to seek justice or to seek righteousness, etc. That's of course not what I'm saying here. What I am saying is We need to spend more time understanding the dynamics of shame. Shame is very different from guilt, and maybe we should do a webinar just on that distinction alone. But we have a lot to say in that those materials to avoid the shame effect. And I would encourage you to consider even your own way of being and ways of seeking righteousness, of seeking justice. Incidentally, the Greek word is the same word that gets translated both ways.
All right, Nathan and Cheryl will take us out. Nathan?
So a couple closing points. Beth has provided the Thriving in Change link into the chat room. And so be sure to click on that before the Zoom webinar is over. Also, if you can give us your feedback, Beth has also provided that link into the chat room as well. We're going to explore together how to continue these webinars into 2022. So we will send out an email to each of you in 2022 as we look together for the future of these webinars. And with that, Cheryl, would you give us a blessing and send us out into the life of God?
Sure, no problem. Sorry, can you hear me? Okay. All right, I'll give a blessing. Well, thanks for joining, everyone. And it's been wonderful to hear, Nathan, your story in particular. So I guess my first blessing would be, may all of us accidentally engage God in our neighbor. I'm thankful for Pat and your wisdom, and ask that we have a more discerning spirit as we go forward, as we see with Pat this morning. And then with Mark's thoughts, I'm just grateful for the opportunity to talk about what God is up to, and ask that we would be better listeners going forward.
All right, y'all. Peace.